The Mega Man series raises a lot of questions, especially the X games. Is the Maverick virus really just due to a failed reproduction of X's code, or was it something Wily cooked up after experimenting with Robo-Enza? What happened to Axel after X8? How canon is Command Mission? Is his name Mega Man X or just X? Why does X6 suck so bad? Or, for this video, why did Iris stay dead and should she maybe not? After playing through the 4th X game 3 times last month, I've kind of been thinking about Iris and whether it was really fair to kill her off the same game she was introduced in, so the question has been plaguing my thoughts for a bit. Before we start on that query, let's begin with a much more basic one. Who is, or was, Iris? In addition to the Maverick Hunters, there was another group known as Repliforce. This organization was much more military-minded and sometimes assisted the Hunters. Repliforce scientists attempted to create the ultimate Reploid, one that was both a powerful warrior and also possessed the heart of a pacifist. This proved too much of a contradiction though, and the scientists had to instead split these two ideals into 2 separate robots. A super close brother-sister pair. The battle-minded half was given a beam saber and the position of second in command of Repliforce, and named Colonel. The more peace-oriented one was made a negotiator and support unit and named Iris. While still part of Repliforce, due to the cross-pollination between the two groups, Iris would sometimes work as a navigator for the Maverick Hunters, providing advice and other assistance to agents in the field. This is how she met X and, more significantly, Zero, and a romance started to form between the two. During the events of Mega Man X4, a terrorist attack occurs on Sky Lagoon and causes this aerial city to fall upon another beneath it, killing millions. At the same time, Iris is kidnapped and taken to the site, possibly as bait to draw Colonel and his men to the scene of the crime. Whether this was the intent or not, Zero soon rescues Iris and in the process discovers Repliforce at the scene of the attack. He asks the group to disarm and come in for questioning so that they can hopefully clear them of suspicion, but Colonel lets their pride do the talking and refuses. The organization soon after declares their independence, and while they claim to not want war, they start construction on a space station called Final Weapon, in case their wishes are not granted. The Maverick Hunters, being understandably concerned with Repliforce's refusal to cooperate, apparent coup, and giant space laser that they're making, don't take this lying down. While desperately not wanting either side to fight, due not only to her pacifism, but also her divided loyalties and affections, Iris still stays by Zero's side and serves as his navigator. When Colonel challenges Zero to a duel, she's able to stop the battle, but despite constant pleadings for him not to fight her brother, the second time Zero faces Colonel, it's to the death and the latter falls. Iris disappears immediately afterwards, and the next time Zero sees her, it's aboard the newly launched Final Weapon. Holding her brother's core, Iris confronts Zero with what he's done, combines with it, and forms a powerful ride armor that she uses to fight him. Zero manages to defeat her, but not without dealing fatal damage, and as she lies dying in his arms, Iris wishes she could have lived with him in a peaceful world, only for Reploids, before expiring. Afterwards, Zero laments what's happened, but still manages to go on to defeat the rest of Repliforce and Sigma, and Iris stays dead. What's up with that? There's a big reason why Iris hasn't come back, and that's that it would undo everything that her death caused and the weight it had. This stays with Zero, and while he often does try to stay positive and confident, especially in front of X, on the whole he becomes much more somber and melancholy after losing Iris. He blames himself, and while there were a lot of extenuating circumstances, this belief isn't entirely unfounded. This impact holds true for the audience as well. Iris' death is one of the most memorable scenes in not just the X series, but the Mega Man franchise as a whole. While a good bit of this is due to how it was presented in the English localization, I'd argue it owes just as much to how much heavier the story of X4 was, and how straight up tragic her and Colonel's passing was. If Iris is revived all willy-nilly, suddenly all of that doesn't matter. Death is pointless. There are no consequences. It's like how in comic books, no one ever stays dead, except for Uncle Ben. Killing off beloved characters used to mean something. When Doomsday killed Superman, people openly wept. When Darkseid took out Batman many years later though, the reception was much more tepid, and it was never really a question of if, only when he would be back. Heck, if the Mega Man series got too cavalier with bringing back its folks, it could cross beyond that into Dragon Ball territory, where the characters stop even treating death as something to mourn over and more like just an inconvenience. So yeah, there are reasons why Iris should stay in the past, but let's look at the other side of things. To start with, let me refute most of what I just said. Death in the X series is already meaningless. At the end of each game, you refight all 8 Mavericks that you already took out. But maybe that's not the best argument, since it's not clear whether these fights involve a full resurrection, just an automaton-like copy with no will of its own, or if it's just game mechanics. Let's move on to Sigma, who gets destroyed each game and then still comes back the next. Again though, maybe not the best example since he's so entwined with the Maverick virus that at points it shares his name, and they become pretty much the same entity. He can pretty much take physical form whenever he wants by just downloading himself into any body that he can get his digital hands on. The only reason he keeps coming back as a big bald beefcake in fabulous armor is because that's just his preferred aesthetic. However, there are 2 characters that their cycles of death and rebirth are hard to refute as anything but arbitrary. The first is, you guessed it, Zero. The first time he dies mirrors Iris' death in a lot of ways. It happens the game they're introduced in. They spend the whole story supporting the player and then die right beside them after having a few moments to utter their final words, and their passing has a deep effect. Only then Zero comes back the very next game, mostly because the game's creators thought he was too cool to stay dead. The series tries to give him a dramatic and meaningful death again in X5, which was supposed to be the final game in the series, but when Capcom decided to keep it going, because money, Zero just kinda waltzes back in with little to no explanation like nothing ever happened. Even when he dies for the final time, he still somehow comes back as some orphan's pager. Death is truly dead, at least as far as he's concerned. Then there's Vile, or Vava if you're cultured. He super dies multiple times, X destroying him to the point where he explodes and leaves nothing behind. He comes back to play antagonist multiple times, and while I think he mentioned someone designing a new body for him once or twice, it's really not explained how he comes back. Whether they managed to scrounge up enough dust to somehow revive him, if they have a copy of his mind they just download onto a new frame, or if Sigma just finds some young maverick, roughly Vile's height, slaps a Mandalorian helmet on him, and feeds him a few lines is kind of up in the air. But the point is, Death really doesn't seem to have much of a hold on the guy. To reiterate, resurrecting Iris doesn't make Death pointless because Death is already pointless. Of course, that still does leave the issue of undoing some of Zero's character development. To some degree, Zero still went through the events of X4 and trauma is trauma, and he's been through enough else that Iris coming back wouldn't change much with him, though that is kind of a weak argument. Perhaps a more salient point would be to bring up how close what happened to Iris is to fridging, a generally discouraged writing trope. While I think X4's plot did have a bit more nuance and Iris had more agency than most damsels, there's still enough similarities there that executing her the same game she was introduced does feel kinda cheap. That does bring up my next point, and that's how little we know Iris. In my last playthrough, she was alive for less than 2 hours, which isn't a lot of time to get acquainted with someone. Typically, the more you know about a character, the fonder you become of them, assuming they're not a total tool. Sure, I know about her backstory and feel sympathy for what happens to her in the game, but who was she beyond that? What did she like to do in her free time? Did she and Zero go on any dates? Was she friends with any of the other characters, like maybe X or Alia? Did she have any qualms about working for Repliforce and the Maverick Hunters, even if she wasn't directly involved with combat? Stuff like that. My problem is that I like Iris, I just know I could have liked her more if she wasn't just a one-shot character, and that's largely what got me to make this video. To that end, I've come up with 3 solutions that I think would solve this problem. Option 1 is the most straightforward and least creative, and that's the just do it. Just bring her back. You don't need to get too fancy here, and any of the things that I already mentioned for Zero and Vile would work here as well. My personal choice would be to have her body have been retrieved from the final weapon before it was destroyed, and to have Sigma revive her using her confusion at being recently resurrected to turn her against Zero, much like they did with Zero in X2. And hey, if you manage to take her down without killing her, That would also give Zero a moment of redemption and closure, so more character development instead of regression. I think it'd work well enough, but it's kinda boring, so let's move on. Option 2 would be prequels and remakes. This wouldn't undo anything, so it's probably the least objectionable option, so I could only see people who hate Iris raising a stink about it. It also doesn't disqualify any of my other suggestions, so those could be combined for even more Iris screen time. Both options are pretty self-explanatory and have been done before, so it's not too strange an idea. After X4 came out, Extreme 2 arrived on the Game Boy Color. This game was set before X4, and the creators put Iris in largely because they felt guilty about what they had previously done to her. While the brief cutscenes we got didn't add too much to her character, it was still really nice to see her again. This route also wouldn't have to be limited to just games either. In the past, Capcom has licensed stuff like comics, manga, drama CDs, TV shows, and the like, so as long as they're considered canon and someone bothers to translate them, they could expand upon the lore without maybe committing the full resources needed for a new game. As for remakes, years ago they started to do this with a title called Maverick Hunter X for the PSP. This game was a reimagining of the first X title, with character redesigns, remixed stages, and even making Bile a playable character. It also featured an unnamed navigator that looked like a generic version of Nana. This always struck me as such a wasted opportunity, since they made her seem like such a throwaway character, and they could have easily subbed in someone more established for that role, both for fan service and for more chances for that person to stand out. They could revive and continue the Maverick Hunter X series, or just start again from scratch. But either way, putting Iris in a few games early, and adding in some extra cutscenes to showcase her a little more would do a lot to expand her just beyond the role of the tragic heroine. And hey, if they did a really good job, people just getting into the series for the first time could end up really getting attached to her, and the impact of the fourth entry would be all the more devastating. Heck, I bet even veterans of the series could find themselves hoping for an alternate timeline where things maybe turn out a little less heartrending. Option 3 is by far the most questionable, and even I can't believe I'm saying this, but it's Iris Another. I mentioned in my recap how Iris and Colonel were originally designed to be a single Reploid, and while we don't know exactly what that would have looked like, the gacha title, Rockman X Dive, did its own interpretation of it. While Colonel's influence is certainly apparent, being a game that draws you in with waifus, X Dive's version resembles Iris much more closely. Just less cute and sweet and much taller, looking a lot cooler and more confident. While I'd normally be loath to acknowledge something, much less make it canon, that is such a transparent case of fan service, I think in this exact instance, it could actually have some merit. As for the logic, when Colonel was defeated, he exploded and Iris was only really able to salvage his core. When Iris died, she was pretty much in one piece, so if someone were to collect and repair her, it's possible they could have implemented some of the parts of Colonel that were scattered around, be it on purpose or accidentally. With Iris's body being much more complete, it would make sense for this sibling amalgamation to look much more like the sister. This also gives us a character that is simultaneously both Iris and Colonel, yet neither. This character would have personality traits of both, but given the different ways they would manifest and combine, they would be their own unique thing. There would likely be points where one of their sides would show through more clearly than the other, and they could easily reminisce about their past lives, but the original Iris would essentially be gone. That would still preserve much of the stakes and consequences of her death, while still allowing us to get to know not just her, but also her brother more closely. This also opens up a lot of interesting plot possibilities, like, would they forgive Zero? Would Lair feel threatened by them given her obvious crush on Zero and Iris's previous relationship with him? Would they be able to move past the defunct Repliforce, or would they try to revive it? Given his more casual relationship with the pair, how would X react to their return, and would it affect the popular X-Zero ship? What the heck happened to Axel at the end of X8? Depending on what direction Capcom wanted to take this idea, they could be positioned as either an ally or foe, maybe even a playable character. And I mean, given how it seems like Repliforce meant for them to be a kind of almost ultimate Reploid, they could even give them enhanced stats and abilities to make them the unofficial easy mode, like what Nintendo did with Toadette and Nabbit. It wouldn't be all that different than inputting a code on the main menu to immediately unlock the ultimate armor, come to think of it. Just please don't actually call this character Iris Another. That name's silly. It seems like the Japanese name is Harmonious Iris, so maybe Harmony could work? So those are my thoughts on Iris coming back and some ways I think Capcom could manifest it. But what do you think? Do you miss Iris and want to see more of her? Or do you think she already had exactly as much screen time as she needed? Do you think any of the ideas I suggested would work? Do you have some of your own that you think would work better? Or do you think bringing her back in any way, shape, or form would be unnecessary and just besmirch her legacy? Or do you maybe dislike the character in general and clicked on this video to hate watch it? Hopefully there's one thing we can all agree on, and that's that we could really use an X9. Please feel welcome to let me know your thoughts regardless in the comments, maybe consider subscribing if you found this amusing, and as always, thanks for watching.